It all started one summer evening when Daniel's brother, Paul, came to stay with us. He hadn't been around much, living on the other side of the country for years, so when Daniel suggested he visit for a while, I thought nothing of it. After all, it was family. I was happy to help with hosting, even if Paul and I had barely exchanged more than a few words over the years. He arrived late, after a long drive, and I remember greeting him at the door. Paul had that tired but easy smile that made him seem approachable, more down to earth than I remembered. I offered him a glass of water, and we spent a few minutes catching up, while Daniel put the kids to bed. Paul was polite, but there was a slight tension, something unspoken in the air that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the fact that he was family but still felt like a stranger in some ways. As the days passed, Paul blended into our routine with surprising ease. He wasn't loud or imposing, and in fact, he seemed to enjoy his time alone during the day, while Daniel and I worked. Sometimes we'd pass each other in the house, sharing small talk in the kitchen or in the backyard. Little things, like offering to help me with the groceries or fixing a leaky faucet I had been complaining about, made him seem considerate, even thoughtful. It wasn't until one evening, when Daniel had to work late, that I started to notice how different things felt, with just Paul and me. I was preparing dinner, chopping vegetables, and Paul offered to help. I didn't think much of it, but as we stood side by side at the counter, there was a strange awareness of his presence. I could feel him near me without needing to look, like the air had changed. He'd crack a small joke about the mess I was making, and I'd laugh, maybe a little too easily. I brushed it off. It was harmless, just a little friendly banter. But there was a moment, as I passed him a plate, that our hands touched, lingering for just a beat longer than necessary. My stomach fluttered, not in that sweeping, dramatic way you read about, but in a quiet, almost subconscious way. I pulled my hand back, pretending not to notice, but the tension hung there, like a thread pulled too tight. We sat down to eat, and the conversation flowed smoothly enough, but there was something simmering underneath, something that made me hyper-aware of every glance, every casual comment. He asked me about my day, and I found myself talking more than usual, filling the silence with stories, trying to ignore the fact that I was suddenly paying attention to the way he listened, how his eyes stayed on me just a little longer than normal. By the time Daniel came home, I was relieved. The evening had felt innocent enough, but there was an edge to it that made me restless. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that Paul was just being kind, and I was reading too much into it. After all, nothing had happened. But as I lay in bed that night, with Daniel sleeping soundly beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between Paul and me had shifted, even if only in the smallest, most imperceptible way. The days that followed were normal enough, but there was a subtle undercurrent of something I couldn't quite shake. I didn't avoid Paul, but I was more careful, aware of myself in ways I hadn't been before. I would busy myself with the kids, or with work, always trying to keep a comfortable distance. But the tension was still there, hovering between us, in the quiet moments when we were left alone. One afternoon, the house was quiet. The kids were at a friend's house, and Daniel was stuck at the office again. I was tidying up in the living room when Paul walked in, looking relaxed in a way that made the space feel even smaller. He asked if I needed help, and I declined, but he lingered, watching me with that easy smile of his. "You seem tense," he said, his voice low and casual, but with a hint of something else. I laughed it off, pretending it was nothing, but he stepped closer, just enough to make me aware of the closeness. I wasn't sure if it was intentional or if I was reading too much into it again, but the air between us seemed to hum with an energy I hadn't felt in years. "I'm fine," I said, but my voice came out softer than I intended. Paul didn't move away. Instead, he picked up one of the cushions from the couch and started arranging them with a sort of nonchalance that only heightened my awareness of him. "I was just thinking," he said after a pause, his voice quiet. "It's been nice being here. I don't usually get the chance to be around family." His eyes met mine, and there was something unsaid between us. I couldn't tell if it was just in my head or if he felt it too, but I didn't ask. I tried to focus on what he was saying, but my mind was a few steps ahead, anticipating, wondering if he would take a step closer or if I would move away. It was an odd dance, one that felt more like a slow build-up than a conversation. He didn't touch me, didn't even come close enough to break any boundary. But there was a weight to the moment that made me feel like we were standing on the edge of something we weren't supposed to. "I'm glad you're here too," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The words felt heavy, loaded with more meaning than I intended. I wondered if he could hear it, if he felt the same pull that I did. The room felt warmer, or maybe it was just me. I turned away, trying to focus on something else, anything else. But when I moved to walk past him, he reached out. Just a light touch on my arm. It wasn't inappropriate, not exactly, but it lingered longer than it should have. I looked up at him, caught in the moment, unsure of what to do next. There was a long, drawn-out pause. I should have pulled away, should have said something to break the tension, but instead I stood there, frozen, waiting for him to make the next move. His hand dropped to his side, but the electricity between us didn't disappear. It was still there, thrumming under the surface, waiting. Just then, the sound of the front door opening jolted us both out of the moment. Daniel was home. Paul stepped back, his expression neutral, as if nothing had happened. I took a deep breath, grateful for the interruption, but also confused by the strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Dinner that night was like any other, the three of us chatting casually, but I could feel Paul's eyes on me from across the table. I didn't look at him, didn't dare to, but I couldn't stop thinking about that brief, charged moment in the living room, the moment where everything could have changed, but didn't. In the days that followed, I kept my distance from Paul as much as possible. I stayed busy, made excuses to leave the room when it was just the two of us, and tried to act like everything was normal. But inside, I couldn't forget the way his hand had lingered on my arm, or the way the air between us had crackled with tension. It wasn't that anything had actually happened, but it felt like we had crossed an invisible line, a line that I wasn't sure we could step back from. Paul didn't push. He acted as if everything was perfectly fine, casual, and friendly, like always, but every now and then I'd catch him looking at me, just for a second too long, and each time it sent a ripple of awareness through me that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that anyone else would have noticed, but I noticed. Every glance, every brush of his arm as we passed each other felt like a silent reminder of the moment in the living room, the moment that hadn't gone further, but could have. One evening, After the kids were asleep, Daniel asked Paul to join him in the garage to help with a project. I was relieved when they both disappeared outside, leaving me alone in the quiet house. But after a while, Daniel came back inside, grabbing his jacket. "Forgot I had a late shift tonight," he said, kissing me on the cheek as he rushed out the door, leaving Paul behind. The garage door closed with a thud, and suddenly it was just the two of us again. I busied myself in the kitchen, pretending I hadn't noticed, but I felt Paul's presence before he even spoke. He walked in, leaning against the counter, watching me in that relaxed, unhurried way he had. I couldn't shake the awareness of how close we had come to something more last time we were alone. And now, here we were again. "You don't have to keep avoiding me," Paul said quietly, his voice low but clear. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't turn around, didn't want to face him, but I could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I'm not avoiding you," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. It felt like a lie, and we both knew it. Paul stepped closer, and I could feel the shift in the room again, the tension tightening like a string pulled too tight. I kept my back to him, hoping he would take the hint, but he didn't. Instead, he closed the space between us, his voice barely above a whisper. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked. I turned around slowly, meeting his eyes. There was no use denying it anymore. The tension between us had been growing, inching closer to the surface with every passing day. And now, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't take back. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but the words rang hollow. We both knew exactly what he was talking about. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, feel the heat radiating between us. It would be so easy, I thought, to close the distance, to let the tension snap. But then, just as quickly, reality came crashing back in. The kids were asleep upstairs. Daniel would be home soon, and this, whatever this was, could never happen. "I can't," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Paul looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally nodded. He stepped back, giving me space, the tension between us fading but not disappearing completely. "I know," he said quietly, and without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. I stood there for a long time, trying to steady my breathing, my heart still racing from the intensity of the moment. Nothing had happened. We hadn't crossed that line, but the tension was still there, lingering in the air like a secret we both carried. When Daniel came home later that night, I smiled and kissed him like everything was normal, but inside, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to something I never thought I'd even consider, and I wondered if Paul was thinking about it too. The days after that night felt heavy, like something unspoken still lingered between us. I tried to focus on my usual routine, but every time Paul and I were in the same room, the tension crackled like static. It was nothing overt, just a glance here, a fleeting touch there. We both acted like nothing had happened, but I knew that moment in the kitchen had changed something between us. One afternoon, Daniel mentioned he'd be away for a weekend work retreat, leaving Paul to stay behind and help with the kids. I felt my stomach knot at the thought of being alone in the house with him. Part of me was anxious, but another part, a part I was ashamed to admit existed, was curious. There was something undeniable about the connection between us, even though I knew it could never go anywhere. The weekend arrived, and for the most part, everything felt normal. Paul was his usual relaxed self, helping with the kids, chatting casually, and making everything seem like it was fine. But the awareness never left. Every brush of his hand, every shared glance, felt charged with meaning. I did my best to stay busy, to keep things light. But as the sun set that evening and the house grew quiet again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. We sat in the living room, the kids fast asleep, watching some mindless TV show neither of us was really paying attention to. The silence between us felt thick, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken words. I could feel him glancing at me from the other end of the couch, and I didn't dare look back. But then he spoke, breaking the stillness. "Why do you keep pretending like nothing's happening?" His voice was low, almost too quiet. I turned to face him, my heart racing. "Because nothing is happening." He shook his head, a small sad smile on his lips. "You know that's not true." We sat there in silence for what felt like forever. I could feel the tension rising again, pulling us towards something we couldn't take back. It would be so easy, I thought. Just one step, one moment, and everything would change. But then, reality crashed in again. The kids, Daniel, our lives. The weight of what we had to lose settled over me like a heavy blanket. "I can't," I whispered. "I won't." Paul's eyes softened, and he nodded, understanding. "I know," he said quietly. "I'd never want to hurt you." There was a pause before he stood up, moving to leave the room. But before he walked out, he turned to me one last time, his expression both tender and resigned. "Take care, okay?" And just like that, he was gone. I sat there alone, the silence of the house pressing in on me. We hadn't crossed the line, but the almost affair had left its mark, a silent understanding between us that we'd both carry forever. Life returned to normal after that. Paul went back to his life. Daniel came home, and things were as they always were. But every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about that weekend, about what could have happened, but didn't. And while I knew I had made the right choice, I also knew that part of me would always wonder what might have been. It was a secret I would carry with me, locked away, never to be spoken of again.